So welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Glen. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Solar United Neighbors. And this is a 1 hour long webinar on defending your solar rights, and in particular about the NERA's petition and threat to net metering. I see an initial question. Yes, the recordings for this webinar will be made available to all the registrants after this. So we have a packed agenda, and so let's go to the next slide. And I'll talk to you about what you can expect. First of all, in addition to myself, our featured speakers will be Nathan Phelps from Vote Solar, Dave Anderson from the Energy and Policy Institute, and Liz Veazey, my colleague at Solar United Neighbors. And you can take a look at the agenda next. So I'll say a few words about the logistics and brief introductions. Nathan Phelps from Vote Solar will talk about the NERA petition and the specific process that's ongoing right now. Dave Anderson from Energy and Policy Institute will talk about what is known about the group behind the petition. And Liz Veazey will talk about what people on this call and elsewhere can do to impact the outcome. Then we'll follow up with Q&A, and then we'll finish. Next slide, please. A little word about logistics. If you have questions, and you can enter them at any time, you can type the questions into the Q&A feature at Zoom. You can take a look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see Q&A, click there. You could also feel free to use the chat function, but we're going to try to use the Q&A for questions. And again, all webinar registrants are going to receive an email after the webinar with a link to view the recording of the webinar as well as this slide presentation. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please just post to the chat and one of our staff will try to respond. All right, next slide. So our first speaker is Nathan Phelps. Nathan is a regulatory director for our partner organization, Vote Solar. He's going to talk about the specifics of the petition and what's at stake. Nathan?
Thanks, Glenn. And thank you to everyone attending the webinar. Happy to have you here and happy to chat about this. So first, NERA. NERA is the New England Ratepayers Association. Dave will be discussing NERA, so we can just set the organization aside for a minute. And then FERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Each state has an agency that oversees the electric utilities. They regulate them. These are often called Public Utility Commissions, or PUCs. And the PUCs oversee how people pay for electricity. That's typically referred to as retail. Well, FERC is the federal equivalent of these PUCs, these Public Utility Commissions. And FERC oversees how essentially utilities sell electricity to other utilities and how large power plants sell electricity to utilities. And this is typically referred to as wholesale. It's important that you kind of understand the dynamic between the states and the federal government in this conversation, which is why I'm just trying to lay the foundation now. Next slide. So just a little bit about Vote Solar. We're a national nonprofit. We've been around for coming up on 20 years, and we're really trying to bring solar into the mainstream, make it very, very common across the country. Next slide. So how did we get here? What is happening? That's basically what I'm trying to cover for everyone on the webinar right now. Next slide. This all started about 6 weeks ago. Personally, to me, seems about an eternity ago. So a lot's happened in the last 6 weeks. So FERC got this petition from NERA. The next day, they set this comment deadline for just 30 days, which is a pretty tight turnaround. We started to see a lot of interventions. It's a fancy way of saying people are getting involved in the proceeding at FERC. One of those interventions was from NARUC. And NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which is the kind of association of PUCs, basically. So they're representing PUCs from all of the states. Well, NARUC asked for a 90-day extension. NERA disagreed. They said, maybe 30 days. And FERC actually agreed with that 30-day extension. So we actually have a deadline to participate in this proceeding, to submit comments of June 15th. June 15th is not that far away, just essentially a couple weeks away. So we still have a lot of work to do to continue to spread the word about this petition and to build as strong a coalition as possible to oppose the petition. Next slide. So what exactly is the petition? NERA is essentially asking FERC to take away the ability of states to implement net metering, at least as we traditionally think of net metering. Specifically, what NERA is asking is that they want FERC to assert control any solar customer electricity to the grid. Stated differently, NERA wants FERC to say that net metering is a wholesale program and therefore under the jurisdiction of FERC, and it's not a retail program, which would be under the jurisdiction of the state. NERA essentially wants FERC to treat solar homeowners as power generators, large power plants. So that's a lot of jargon. Let me try to actually explain this in a little bit more practical terms. With traditional net metering, if you are generating more electricity than you're using in that moment, then you can run your meter backwards. And so at the end of the month, you're only billed for your net usage of electricity. NERA is asking FERC to require that solar customers only receive a wholesale credit for any electricity that's exported to the grid. This is a double whammy. So first, it eliminates monthly netting, which is a really simple process. And then the second is the value of the energy that would be exported to the grid would be greatly reduced. So we'd be going from retail credits down to wholesale, which, depending on where you are in the country, can be quite substantial and it accumulates very quickly over time as far as the loss. Next slide. So net metering is not a new issue. Net metering was first implemented on a statewide basis almost 40 years ago. And then 20 years ago, FERC actually looked at this specific issue. And at that time, FERC said, this is a state issue. This is not a federal government issue. NERA wants FERC to change course. They want FERC to reverse their position. And that essentially is where we're at right now, as far as what the petition is doing and trying to reverse the existing divide or jurisdiction between state and federal government. Next slide. I cannot emphasize enough how big the impacts of this would be if FERC were to agree with the petition. So millions of households across the country net meter, about 100,000 commercial and industrial customers net meter. All of those customers would have greatly reduced value if FERC was to change their position. We're talking thousands of dollars for these customers, in the range of hundreds of dollars per year in lost value. On top of that, almost every state would actually have to go through and start a proceeding to change their net metering policies because they essentially would be preempted by the federal government. And all of that would be taking place in the middle of a pandemic. And this really fundamentally has the potential to shift the dynamic between the state and the federal government as far as who has control over what policies. So these impacts are very, very large. Even if there's a small chance that FERC agrees with NERA, it really requires all of us to be fighting this as much as possible. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nathan. We appreciate it. We'll be addressing a lot of the questions that are coming in during the Q&A period, so feel free to type them in as they occur to you, and we will address as many as we can at that time. Our next speaker is Dave Anderson, and Dave is the Policy and Communications Manager for the Energy and Policy Institute, and they have done some digging about who the group is behind the petition. Dave?
Hello, everyone. You can jump to the next slide. So who is the New England Ratepayers Association? That's a question that's bugged clean energy supporters in New England for quite a few years. It's actually been asked publicly by state lawmakers from both parties, and they've so far received no clear answers from NERA. The group was formed in 2013 and very quickly ramped up to fight the Cape Wind project, and then later that year actually supported a federal gas pipeline permitting bill that was backed by the gas and utility industry. So they're definitely not a NIMBY group when it comes to energy projects. And in that case, we're very much opposing a major offshore wind project, and then soon thereafter supporting a pretty big bill that was backed by the fossil fuel industry. The group's executive director, and really the only publicly active member of their board of directors and officer, is an individual named Mark Brown. He used to run an ice cream shop and then landed a job with Freedom Works, which was a Tea Party group that's still active and received fossil fuel industry money back in the 2000s. He now runs a lobbying firm that represents the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, a private printing company, and others. You can jump to the next slide. So NERA doesn't disclose the identities of its members and funders, but it does say on its website and elsewhere that it represents the interests of families and businesses in New Hampshire, thus the ratepayers in its name. Public Citizen has presented some evidence to FERC in the past and made the point publicly that, based on evidence, that NERA is funded by a relatively small number of contributors, and they suspect that NERA is actually operated more like an industry group and backed by a small number of companies. That's particularly important in the case of this petition because it may very well be that NERA is backed by either fossil fuel or utility interests that would directly benefit from their challenge of net metering. So short answer is we still don't know exactly who funds NERA, but we do know a lot about the group's ties to fossil fuel and utility interests and how the group often aligns with these interests to oppose clean energy policies in states like New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts, and now federally. We do also know that NERA works very closely with members of the powerful Sununu family, including two brothers of New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who's opposed the expansion of net metering in New Hampshire and counts utilities among his top donors. And the image here is just of a event I attended a while back, an annual energy symposium that's often sponsored by NERA and most of the state's major electric utilities and fossil fuel interests. You can jump to the next slide. So here's a few ways that NERA is connected to the fossil fuel and utility industries. On the left top-hand side here, you can see a group called the New England Coalition for Affordable Energy, which is publicly backed by the American Petroleum Institute and is essentially a project of that organization. NERA's executive director, Mark Brown, is listed as an advisor for that coalition, and NERA is also listed on his website as a member. So pretty clear tie to the oil and gas industry there. NERA is also a member of another group called the Consumer Energy Alliance, who is actually made up more of producers of energy that includes major fossil fuel companies and utilities, as well as some large industrial energy users. And they have also been active in fighting expansions of net metering in New Hampshire and attempting to weaken the existing net metering policies here, sometimes in the same docket as NERA. A few years ago, Mark Brown quietly formed another shadowy group. At the bottom here, you can see the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund. And that group hasn't been very active publicly, but it has disclosed in paperwork with the IRS and with the state of Delaware, where it's incorporated, that its board of directors includes James and Michael Sununu, the Sununu brothers I mentioned earlier, a few Republican state legislators who've been very active in fighting net metering bills in New Hampshire, and also a fellow named Geoffrey Mitchell of Brant Energy, who is a longtime consultant for the gas and utility industries. So you can see that Mark Brown wears a lot of hats, and often he's in a room with other people wearing hats representing the fossil fuel and utility industry, as I'll get into on the next slides. Can you switch slides? So here you have a now no longer live website of Sununu Enterprises, which is run by James and Michael Sununu, who work very closely with NERA. And as you can see, they talk about how their company has worked with power companies involved in power development and quite a few other utility related industries. They do not, of course, disclose who those power companies are, which remains an interesting question that may also be answered eventually. Next slide. And then I mentioned that the other member of the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund's board of directors is Geoffrey Mitchell, who runs a consulting firm called Brant Energy. They interestingly do disclose the clients that they've represented in the past. And as you can see, it's a pretty long list of both domestic and foreign fossil fuel and utility companies. So I think that's one of the more direct links to someone who does work directly for the fossil fuel and utility industries that we have recently learned about for NERA. Next slide. So the NERA petition was filed by a couple of attorneys at Steptoe Johnson, one of whom's name is David B. Raskin. And he was active pitching the idea of a FERC petition challenging state net metering policies to utility audiences in 2014 and probably in the years around that. Both at meetings held by the Edison Electric Institute, as well as something called the Harvard Electricity Policy Group, whose executive director, Ashley Brown, often testifies against net metering on behalf of utility clients. And Ashley Brown is actually NERA's expert witness, whose testimony is included in its net metering petition to FERC. The other interesting thing about the docket is you have seen some major utilities like AEP, Dominion Energy, and Duke Energy file to intervene, but they haven't taken a position yet. So say the next few weeks between now and when they would have to file any comments that they wish to go on the record with would be a good time to ask them about any connections that they have to the petition and what their position on it will be. Next slide, please. What's being done to reveal NERA's funders? A lot of stakeholders are asking FERC to require NERA to disclose its funders, and in particular, which members or funders it's representing with its net metering petition. And as I mentioned earlier, that seems really key because it's important to know whether its members or funders will directly benefit from this challenge to net metering policies across the nation. A lot of reporters are also asking questions of Mark Brown about his funders. And some FOIAs have been filed by different environmental groups, some of which can be found online. I know in one interesting case, a local reporter here in New England asked Mark Brown for comment, not only on whether they're funded by fossil fuel or utility interests, but specifically whether they are representing utility interests and are funded by them. And he didn't respond to that more specific question, which was interesting because he's responded in the past to more general questions about who their funders are. So sort of a non-answer that may speak volumes, but we'll see. I've also included a link here on this slide to a page that we put together just with a lot more background information about NERA, and it gets into a lot of the group's connections to the fossil fuel and utility industry and different players who represent those industries in New England. So feel free to check that out. It's a lot more information that I can really unpack here.
Cool, thanks, Dave. Glenn, you gonna?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dave, very much. Our next speaker is my colleague, Liz Veazey. She's a solar advocacy campaigner for Solar United Neighbors. And she's going to talk about what we can do about this situation and what the grassroots opposition can do. Liz?
Great, thanks, Glenn. And thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. So yeah, I just wanted to start with Solar United Neighbors' theory of change and a little bit about us as an organization. So we really believe in this circular theory and really doing this over and over through our solar co-ops. So we help people go solar together to make it easier and lower cost for people to go solar. So we do that a lot, and then we get people involved in other ways. We host solar congresses, solar scouting programs like Sun Scout, happy hours, webinars like this. We do a national solar tour in partnership with some other organizations every fall. And we continually are working to mobilize and organize rooftop solar owners to fight for their rights. And so we have helped people engage and get better state policies, like some recent policies in Virginia around homeowners associations and clean energy legislation. I think there was a question around that we'll circle back to. We've been involved at state regulation, at utility commissions, and then nationally in things like this petition. So we're continually sort of building the movement and really excited to have everybody here joining us. And wanted to touch a little bit on solar rights. This is sort of how we articulate those, and we think particularly in the NERA case, that this is a really important place for us to stand up and protect our solar rights. So, you know, we think they're nonpartisan and everyone should have access to solar, whether on their roof or part of community solar. And it's really important for it to be part of a competitive market, and that some version of net metering and fair compensation is really important. So that's really the basis of where we're coming from. And I'm really excited about the Statue of Liberty solar image that one of our staffers created here. Yeah, and we, you know, as solar homeowners, business supporters and supporters, we all have an important role to protect solar rights, and we're compelling advocates. So we're going to talk about how people can do that around this NERA petition. And so I wanted to show this slide. I think, Nathan, you made this slide, or we got this from you, thanks. And I think Nathan has been tracking the details of this a little more closely, so we can dig into that if people have questions. But just wanted to sort of show some of the folks who have intervened so far. And so in our strategy in around this campaign, working closely with Vote Solar and the solar Energy Industry Association, or SEIA, we decided to target governors to get states to intervene in this petition. And so there are some that have already taken action, either utility commissions or the blue, the yellow or attorney generals, the red or other state agencies like state energy offices, for example, in Colorado. And then in some places, like in DC, Maryland, a couple other states, multiple agencies are all taking action. And, you know, we don't know which side these people are going to come down on, but, you know, we think, and maybe Nathan can probably talk more about this, but we think that a lot of them are going to stand up for states' rights. And even if they don't like net metering as a policy per se, that they think that it is important for states to be able to set these policies and decide for themselves. So that's what we think, but we don't, you know, we're not sure exactly which way people are going to come down. And there's still a lot of governors who, and a lot of, you know, attorney generals who haven't taken action. So the basis of, you know, how we're telling people to take action, we worked closely with Vote Solar to launch savesolar.org as a website to make it easy for people to take action. And I'm sure one of my colleagues can put that in the chat. And so for most states, those actions are going directly and immediately to their governor when people take action. For Florida, we decided the governor was not a great target, so we have savesolar.org/act-now for Florida. And so people in Florida, that will not go to the governor, we'll just go, we will bundle the ones from Florida and from all of the other states and submit those to FERC right around June 15th, which is the due date. And on the site, we have a couple different, you can click on a button to have a special letter for being a solar homeowner or business powered by solar. If you work in the solar industry, if you own a solar company, and if you're a solar supporter, we have customized letters. And then we're hoping, we really encourage people to add a sentence or two or more about your situation and why you think this is important, and, you know, your story about solar. So I think that's about it for that site. We've already had 10,000 people take action, so we're really excited about that, but we need more people to take action. We hope everybody here today can take action and can share the action. Yeah, and just a reminder that there's the savesolar.org for everybody, and then savesolar.org/act-now for Florida. And we encourage people to customize your letters. If you can talk about, if you're a solar business and can talk about the number of jobs you create or other impact from your business, and, you know, what the stakes of this are for you, that's important. You could write a letter to your local newspaper. We've already had a few of those published, and a few articles come out this week on this topic. One interviewing a solar homeowner and Solar United Neighbors member, which was exciting. Yeah, and just a reminder again to spread the word and share savesolar.org and ask people to take action. We will follow up from the webinar and make sure everybody gets a sample email you could use to spread the word, and some social share links to make it easy to spread the word. Yeah, and I love that image of the solar electric cord snake, and so we'll make sure people can access those images as well. And yeah, here are all of our organizational websites: Solar United Neighbors, Vote Solar, Energy and Policy Institute. So feel free to reach out. You can reach Glen and I at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org, and we're happy to take your questions. And yeah, Glen, I think I'll pass it back to you. I think we have a whole lot of questions.
We do. Thanks very much, Liz. So again, if you have any specific questions that will not be answered, but there's too many questions for us to answer in the next half hour, but we'll do our best. Feel free to send us an email at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you with the right answer. And again, there's information about the petition on savesolar.org, and we're going to say that a few more times for everybody. We really encourage people to go to that site and to send a message to FERC and your governor to intervene in opposition to the petition. So at this point, I will see what we can do about addressing the questions. First question, I guess I'll pose this to Dave. It has to do with Ashley Brown. It says, did Ashley Brown represent himself as from Harvard in the FERC proceeding like he did in Arizona?
I believe that in his expert testimony, which you can find online, he described himself as in his relationship with Harvard, but then said that he was speaking in his role as a consultant. So he has a private consulting firm on the side. I think in most of the cases that we've looked at, he does draw the line between his views as a consultant and formally representing the Harvard Electricity Policy Group. So interesting exception that you note there for Arizona.
Thank you. I noticed this is not really a question, but it's an observation from Luis Contreras. It mentioned that the Arkansas congressional delegation, 6 Republicans, have defended states' rights versus DOE. And it raises a question, and I guess I'd pose it to you, Nathan. You had mentioned very clearly that this is an attempt to wrest control from the states to the federal government on energy policies like net metering. Do you get a sense of how many states are opposing this just on states' rights grounds?
It's a good question. It's hard to say definitively the number of states that are opposing this. What we do know is, as of today, we've seen 26 states get involved in some way, shape, or form in this proceeding, plus the District of Columbia. It's likely that all of those states, or the vast majority of those states, will be opposing the petition, especially on the grounds of protecting the state's ability to set net metering policies as a retail program. But I can't say for sure that all of those states will be opposing the petition, just because the states haven't, none of the interveners, none of the participants in the proceeding have had to state their position so far.
Thank you. Here's a question, Dave, again for you, is what's NERA's motivation? Shelley asked, what does NERA get out of this shift to wholesale metering? What's the real motivation here?
I think the petition gets at that. It's pretty clear that they align with the utility industry's view, which has been that net metering creates sort of a cost shift for customers. And, I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that cost shift is pretty insignificant and not really a big deal. And it's interesting, New Hampshire's consumer advocate recently wrote an op-ed saying he wouldn't be intervening in this case, and actually said net metering is not a big deal in New Hampshire. So you can sort of see that NERA is not necessarily representing the interest of ratepayers in its home region on this issue. And also it raises the question, of course, of who funds them and why do their arguments align so closely with those made on net metering by the Edison Electric Institute and a lot of major utilities.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question. Nathan, you may know the answer to this one. It says, does NERA set a threshold amount of kilowatts as to what would be considered wholesale or just all kilowatts? Interesting, detailed question.
Yeah, the way the petition is framed, it's anytime a customer exports electricity to the grid. So it doesn't actually matter the size of your system. That's not the threshold question. The threshold is, does any electricity go from the customer's premise through the meter and onto the electric distribution system? So that's really the issue. It could be you have a very small net metering system, or you have a very large net metering system. That is a little to the argument.
Here's another interesting question. It has to, what effect, I'll recapture the question. What effect would the petition, should FERC grant it, have on power purchase agreements for solar? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll take it. It's a really good question. This fundamentally, the petition fundamentally would change the value proposition for customers. What I mean by that is customers that install solar would receive less value than they otherwise would have if this petition didn't come along. So what that means for power purchase agreements is it kind of changes the underlying assumptions. The amount of money that you have to pay for the energy you produce could no longer represent a savings for the value that you will get from that electricity. So it really depends on the specifics of the power purchase agreement, but fundamentally the underlying assumptions of the value would change as a result of this petition.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have to do with whether or not, if you live in a state or you have a utility that only credits your net metering at the wholesale rate currently, the question that people put in various ways is, so what's the impact? Nathan, I have, my understanding is that there's a very real possibility that net metering could then become a buy all sell all program, which in effect is not net metering as we understand it. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, it really does depend, I will say, on the specifics of the program where you are. So keep in mind that we've really, so far in the discussion, been talking about state level policies, but there are also a lot of policies, net metering policies by cooperatives and also by municipal electricity plants, or munis, as they're typically called. And those really are different across the country, so the details depend drastically on where you're located. However, specifically in regard to the question, there's really two things to look at. Most of the time, the customer is allowed to net over the course of a month, essentially. And that netting ability could go away. So that's the first question. Are you allowed to net? And then if you are allowed to net, then the value for any of your net excess over the course of a month could be reduced. However, there are some net metering policies that do not allow you to net. So this could be basically a state that says you are not allowed to net at all. Anything you export to the grid will be compensated at X amount. That amount could be the wholesale rate. So it could be a situation where you may not be impacted. That is a very, very small percentage, though, of net metering customers in the U.S.
And of course, that doesn't really take into consideration the possible additional tax burden or implications of what they might change.
Correct.
Here's a question from Joy from Virginia. Do we have any, I'll address this to Liz. Do we have any idea what Virginia will do in terms of giving FERC its position? Has any Virginia agency intervened at this point? And Nathan, you might know.
I think that's more of a Nathan question. I can look at my list of the folks. I think we have heard some from electric co-ops in Virginia that they might be coming out against this, but I think we're not sure about that.
As of right now, no state agency in Virginia has intervened in the proceeding. So it's possible they could, over the next couple of weeks, actually weigh in, but they haven't as of yet. That doesn't mean that they're not involved in any way, shape, or form. some states have been getting involved through their essential associations. I mentioned earlier NERA, that's the Association of Public Utility Commissioners. There are also other associations. So there's an association for attorneys general, there's an association for energy offices, and there's an association for ratepayer advocates. It's possible that state agencies specifically could be getting involved through their association. It's hard if that's actually happening in each individual.
Great. Here's an interesting question, and for you, Nathan. There's been a couple of questions like this. So what is the merit, if any, of NERA's petition? Like, what is it really based on besides this hostility that we've identified in representing the interest of monopoly utility?
Well, I may not be the best person to answer this question only because I actually don't think that there's very much merit to their petition. But the underlying argument is really that any time an entity generates electricity and exports it to the grid, that is inherently a sale for resale. It's a technical term that really goes back to federal statutory language, but basically the argument is anytime somebody exports electricity to the grid, that is being by design meant to be sold to somebody else, and therefore it would be federal authority. I do not agree with that argument, but that's what they're asserting.
Here's a question about will Southern Alliance for Clean Energy be opposing this petition? And I believe, Liz, they have. Is that correct?
Yeah, they are definitely on our side. They sent the action alert, I think, to at least their Florida list. I'm not sure if they are officially intervening, but I think they're definitely supportive of this.
Great. Here are two interesting questions. One is from our friend in DC, Ronald Bethea, who is a producer of a radio show that often talks about solar in Black America. The question is, how are you engaging the African American community on this issue? Liz, do you want to take that question?
Oh, sorry, I was trying to type some answers to other questions.
Happy to
sure,
chat
Nathan, please
if you want. So I'll note that I've been in contact with the NAACP about this issue to make sure that they were aware of it. The NAACP, the national, and also each of the chapters has, or most of them have some type of energy justice type of committee, and I've been in contact with a lot of them in order to make sure that they're aware of this issue. We, meaning Vote Solar, have also created a sign-on letter that basically has a heavy focus on access and equity issues and environmental issues to make sure that the entities, organizations that don't have really the bandwidth to address this issue have an opportunity to speak up and oppose the petition. And we'll send the link for anyone that's interested to sign on to that letter. I'll put that in the chat.
Here's an interesting question. It says, would the petition at all affect solar tariffs for customers who don't receive the retail rate, but get something similar to value of solar? This is something most notably in places like Minnesota. So that's a different way of crediting solar production. I think the answer is we're not sure, but most likely. Nathan, would you agree with that?
Yeah, the devil's definitely in the details on that one. It kind of gets to an issue that we didn't talk about too much, which is how does a state determine the wholesale rate of electricity, or to use the term avoided cost is the technical term for that. And sometimes the avoided cost could be the value of solar, and other times it could be something else. So it really depends on the specifics of the state as to whether or not the avoided cost would be the value of solar if the state has determined the value of solar.
There's a question directly to you, Nathan. You had mentioned that people should contact their state legislators, or at least that's what the questioner understood. The savesolar.org site for nearly everyone encourages your governor to intervene in the case. This is usually done through the Attorney General's office. But Nathan, do you want to elaborate on the state legislative target?
Yeah, I don't think I actually said state legislators. I think I said state officials, which I can understand how that would be understood to be legislators. I would generally say that there are 4 types of state agencies that would, in my opinion, should be interested in intervening and opposing this petition. The first is the Public Utility Commission. They have different names in each of the states, but the regulators of the electric utilities. The second is the ratepayer advocates, because we're talking millions of net metering customers around the country would be potentially impacted by this, and the ratepayer advocates should be defending those customers. The third is the energy office in the state, if the state has an energy office. And then the fourth is the attorneys general, who have a responsibility to protect the state's interest. So those are the 4 different agencies that really should be, once again, in my opinion, interested in intervening and opposing this petition. On top of that, I know that there have been state legislators who have been made aware of this issue and are opposing it. Some of them have actually intervened directly in the docket at FERC, but others may be writing a letter to comment on it.
Here's a question from Sue and Liz. I think this is good for you to answer. It says, is there a way to send comments directly to FERC instead of the governor or state using savesolar.org?
Yeah, I was just typing an answer to that. All of the comments submitted through savesolar.org will be submitted to FERC. So we encourage people to use that. That makes it easy to send comments, to personalize comments, and we're gonna bundle those and submit those. If you feel really strongly, and I think someone else asked about intervening, and Nathan may wanna add to this, but you can go and submit a motion to intervene and or just submit direct comments to FERC, but it's kind of complicated and you have to register. And I think that generally, they're not gonna pay a lot of attention to them. Nathan, do you wanna talk more about that at all?
Yeah, FERC, just like most regulatory agencies, not all, but a lot of regulatory agencies, it's not the type of forum where it's really, really easy to actually go and submit comments. So in the case of FERC, Liz is right, you actually have to register on their website, create an account, basically. And then once you do that, you can go to the docket itself and then ask to intervene or submit comments directly. It is possible, you can do it. It's just not, FERC doesn't make it easy.
No, it is not, which is of course why we are encouraging people to use savesolar.org. I wanted to re-emphasize that the deadline for public comment is June 15th. That's a Monday, June 15th. And so it's very important for people to spend the next couple of weeks. If you care about this issue, if you think the stakes are high for your own solar system and your neighbors, as well as future solar homeowners, please take action on savesolar.org as soon as you can. If we're encouraging governors to intervene in the case, the sooner you do that, the better. We've had thousands and thousands of these responses already. I would also strongly encourage you to customize your response. You know, collectivism is good, but a more detailed and personal message telling your particular solar story about your solar system is more impactful. You know, how would this directly impact you in terms of the material interest? And for solar businesses, this is also very important to talk about what's at stake for your particular business, how many jobs you create, what will be the impact. An interesting question has to do with the timing of this. I think, Nathan, you mentioned in passing that this is all happening while people are preoccupied with the pandemic. So I think the question really has to do whether this is intentional or just is an unfortunate coincidence. I think we would only be able to speculate on this, but Dave, what would you think about this, given what you know about NERA?
It's a really interesting question, since we know their attorney was basically shopping the idea for this petition around back in 2014. So why 6 years later does it suddenly become a real thing? Certainly, whoever funds NERA perhaps made a choice that a group that doesn't reveal their money as being behind this thing is pretty ideal in the midst of a crisis like this, where a lot of solar owners and other stakeholders have a very limited ability to participate, you know, due to everything else that's going on in their lives. So yeah, it seems like a very fair question that I don't think NERA has really been pushed to answer much publicly yet.
There's a question about whether this would impact the member owners of rural electric cooperatives.
So the short answer, likely. It depends on the specifics. Once again, does your co-op have traditional net metering, or do they have something that is similar to, as Glen had mentioned, a buy-all, sell-all type of framework? Now, setting that aside for a second, would the FERC ruling on this, if FERC were to agree with the petition, impact cooperatives? Yes, is the answer to that. So if FERC were to assert jurisdiction, they would be asserting jurisdiction in the continental United States, and with the exception of Texas, that's an odd, wonky thing that we can set aside for a second. But FERC would be asserting jurisdiction for the states and all of the electric utilities in those states.
Thank you. Here's someone who made a suggestion. It'd be helpful if Sun would provide not only the recording of the slides, but a document that lists all the questions and the responses. We'll try our best to do that. I think that's not a technical problem, but I'll find out from our technical people. We'll do that if we can. Here's a question, and it may be applied to a lot of people. This was from Elizabeth. It says, what is a cost shift? This is a term you hear a lot from our utilities who oppose net metering. It's the sort of catch-all phrase that they use to say that net metering is a so-called subsidy, which of course it is not. I don't know if who wants to take this question. I've talked about it a lot, but who wants to explain this whole cost shift mythology?
I'll try to explain it in relatively simple terms, which is just that the argument, which I do not agree with, but the argument is that net metering customers receive more value than they're providing. And as a result of that, these customers are imposing costs on non-participants, basically non-solar customers. That's the argument. I think it's been clearly demonstrated many, many times that these customers provide a lot of value, much more value than they actually receive. So that's the basic argument of cost shift, although I don't agree with it.
Could I add one quick thing there?
Yeah, please.
I think the other thing that is a matter of public record at this point too would be part of the counter argument that the utility industry through the Edison Electric Institute went on the record a few years ago as describing rooftop solar and net metering as presenting a potential, existential challenge to its financial well-being. I think they call it a death spiral in one article. And, there's been a lot of filings with the Security and Exchange Council since then by companies that list net metering and competition from distributed renewables among the risks those utilities face. So I think it's pretty obvious that they have a financial incentive for fighting net metering. And the cost shift argument has been used to try to downplay that financial incentive.
Yeah, I might add that there are many places to find this information, but we've compiled on the Solar United Neighbors Learn the Issues page on our website, a page that lists all of the so-called value of solar studies, which overwhelmingly debunk this notion that it is a subsidy. And in fact, what almost all of those studies show is that people are not being compensated for the value of their solar that they send to the grid. So there's a lot of studies. They're almost all state-based studies, and nearly all of them are in agreement when you take a look at the full cost benefit. One last question, because there's been a few about Texas, because Texas is unusual, and so we might as well address it. Texas is the only state that has its own grid, the ERCOT. And so this doesn't apply to everybody, but I saw that we obviously have quite a few Texans on the call, and so thought we'd address that. What's the impact if this happens on Texas, given their unique situation?
I shouldn't be surprised. I kind of left this question dangling out there. So basically, a lot of this stuff centers around interstate commerce, which really goes to the federal constitution. And as long as a state is electrically interconnected with another state, then interstate commerce and federal jurisdiction does come into play. But most of Texas, not quite all of Texas, but what most of Texas has done is basically isolated itself electrically from the rest of the United States. So interstate commerce does not come into play. And this area is called ERCOT, which Glenn mentioned. So there are some parts of Texas that are electrically interconnected to the rest of the continental United States, but most of Texas not.
I think we have time for one last question, and it's a very practical one. How much will this cost the average solar homeowner? I know that's a complicated question since every state has a different net metering policy, but what can we say about that? What's the bottom line?
Yeah, every customer is different, so it's hard to give an exact amount here. Every customer uses electricity different, so they may or may not align that usage with the electricity they generate on site from solar. On top of that, the different policies across the country. So it's hard to say exactly, but more than likely the impacts on a residential household would be in the range of, say, $100 to $500 per year.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much, Dave and Liz and Nathan, and thanks very much, Annie, for your help behind the scenes. Really appreciate you all taking the time out of the middle of your day to learn more about this and what you could do. You know, of course, what I'm going to say is please go to savesolar.org. Please share that link with people. Please take action on it. And please, please spread the word. Again, we'll follow up this webinar with links to the additional materials that we talked about, the slides, and the resources that are related to this. We really appreciate it. If you have questions, again, you can get back to us with at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. And thank you very much, and have a great day.